Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in Politics on Trial, I'm going to be talking about perhaps the most notorious trials of the late 19th century, certainly in England. The trials of Oscar Wilde. They were, for Wilde himself, a disaster, a personal tragedy. They destroyed him. But they were also something more. They were a glimpse of an entire society, how it saw itself and how it failed to see itself. In the last episode, which was also about the downfall of a prominent Irishman in England, Parnell, it was the story of two trials, a criminal investigation and then a divorce trial. Today, the downfall of another Irishman in England, it's the story of three trials, one libel trial and two criminal trials. All three took place in an incredibly brief period of time. One of the shocking things, one of the many shocking things seen now about the trials of Oscar Wilde is all three of those trials took place in the space of 2 months, April to May 1895. And once this process was started, it was like a train running down the track with no one able to stop it. It was out of control. And it just accelerated through Wilde's life and destroyed him. All three of the trials in this case were jury trials. But one of the unusual features of them is the different role that the jury played in each case. In the libel trial, the jury was in the end given very, very little discretion. It was instructed by the judge about the verdict it had to reach. It was given one question on which it was allowed to pass judgment, but the direction was very, very clear. In the second trial, the first criminal trial, the jury couldn't reach a verdict, which is a mystery which remains unsolved to this day. No one knows what happened in that jury room, how and why at least one person resisted the rush to judgment. In the third trial, the second criminal trial, the jury was unanimous and returned its verdict very quickly. All of these things took place over hours, a couple of days. This is not a long drawn-out process. The jury reached its verdict quickly, but there was a feeling by that point that it also had very little choice. By the time of the third trial, the result was something close to a fait accompli. So the jury was there in each case, but it was a kind of bystander. Certainly it didn't play a particularly active role. The real drama took place in the courtroom, and it was in the speaking parts, the lawyers, the witnesses, and in each case, in each of these trials, the central witness was Oscar Wilde himself, who was cross-examined and eventually destroyed in the stand as a witness, then as a defendant, and ultimately jailed. One question to ask about the trials of Oscar Wilde for this series, I think, is were they political? So this is broadly speaking a series about political trials, and by political trials I mean those trials in which the politics can be seen through or behind the law. What is happening in the court is not the whole story because there is a political context which is the only thing that can make sense of the legal goings-on. That's partly true in this case, in the sense that I think there is a political context here, and I'll come to it later on, which does make sense, particularly of the criminal prosecution of Oscar Wilde. It's not explicable without some understanding of the politics that surrounded it, the high politics, high Victorian politics. But I think these trials do fit one of the criteria I have in this series, which is some of these trials reveal something about the societies in which they took place. They're a kind of exposing device for the hypocrisies, for the contradictions, for the power dynamics that take place at the top of these societies. And one way to pose that question is to ask the question about how and why the prosecutions happened. What was the motivation for bringing these people to trial? In the case of Oscar Wilde and his criminal prosecution, there was clearly a political motive, and as I say, I'll come to that. But the first trial was a libel case, and in that case, The prosecutor was Wilde, which is something that's easy to forget. I forgot it in an earlier episode in this series when I was talking about Socrates. In my mind, Oscar Wilde was pursued by the Marquis of Queensbury, his nemesis, the man who was bent on destroying him. And so it's easy to imagine that what happened in all three trials is that Wilde was the defendant, but he wasn't. The first trial, Wilde said his opening words in the court, "I am the prosecutor." He prosecuted Queensbury for libel, specifically for the libel of a card that Queensbury had left at Wilde's club, which said, it was never completely established the exact wording, but which said either Oscar Wilde posing sodomite, though what was clear in his terrible aristocratic handwriting was that Queensbury had misspelt the word sodomite. So it actually said either posing sodomite, or posing as sodomite, or posing as a sodomite or sodomite. In the end, in the case, Queensbury wanted the card to be read as posing as a sodomite, so he was accusing Wilde of posing. If the phrase on the card was posing sodomite, then the accusation was harsher because, posing or not, he was explicitly calling Wilde a sodomite, which would be the thing that he would have to prove in court and prove that the accusation was in the public interest. The wording was never completely clear, but it was completely clear what Wilde was objecting to. He was objecting to this man pursuing him with the accusation that he was a criminal because sodomy was a crime in late Victorian England. But also, much more specifically, Queensbury was accusing Wilde of having corrupted Queensbury's son. Alfred Douglas, Lord Alfred Douglas, known as Bosie to his friends, a 24-year-old man, who was widely known to be the on-again, off-again lover of Oscar Wilde. It wasn't always a sexual relationship. It was, in Wilde's eyes at least, always a relationship based on love, the love that can exist between two men, whether there is sex involved or not. That charge led Wilde to prosecute Queensbury for libel. And the prosecution that Wilde undertook was the beginning of the end for him. It was the first step in his downfall. So there are two questions here. Why was Wilde prosecuted when he was? After the failure of his libel action, the Crown, the Solicitor General, came after Wilde, charging him with breaching the terms of a recent legal amendment, which made not just sodomy under the Sodomy Act, but indecency, the other range of sexual activity that might take place between two men, that made it illegal. The Crown came after Wilde for indecency. Why? That's one question. But the bigger question, in a way, the one that is most puzzling, harder to fathom, is why did Wilde himself start this process? Why did he take Queensbury to court, therefore putting himself, Wilde, on the stand to be cross-examined about his life, his beliefs, his relationships, when with hindsight it feels like he didn't need to? It was a choice that Wilde made to initiate a process that would destroy him. Was it a death wish? Was Wilde someone who believed he was doomed anyway? There are romantic versions of Wilde's story in which he embraces his nemesis. That doesn't seem to be the case when you look at what happened. There were too many points along the way when Wilde was clearly horrified by what he had done, and there were one or two points even before it happened when Wilde tried to get out of it. It wasn't completely clear that he was set on this criminal prosecution for libel of the man who was tormenting him. If he had to give a reason, and he did give reasons to various of his friends, it wasn't the card that did it. It wasn't the fact that this accusation had been made, written down, left in a public place. It had been read by the porter at Wilde's club who handed it to him. It wasn't that. It was that there was a campaign underway by Queensbury and that he wouldn't stop unless he was stopped. Queensbury was a notorious bully. He was an extraordinarily thuggish and violent man, and he'd made it clear that he was coming for Wilde and for Wilde's relationship with his son, Bosie, Alfred Douglas. And the card was the culmination of a series of acts in a campaign designed to destroy Wilde and destroy his reputation. Queensbury was going to come to the theatre where The Importance of Being Earnest was performed and throw vegetables at the stage and denounce Wilde. Wilde got wind of this. He blocked Queensbury's entrance to the theatre, so the vegetables were dumped at the theatre door. Queensbury had confronted Wilde in person. He'd come to his house for an interview in which his vehemence was clear and his complete unwillingness to stop what Wilde and Alfred Douglas thought was a campaign of persecution. And we all know the only way to deal with a bully is to bully them back. And the only instrument they had at their disposal was the law. Alfred Douglas in particular was absolutely adamant that the only way to stop his father was to take him on. And so the choice for Wilde, and I think it was clear in his own mind that there was no alternative here, it was a binary choice, was literally fight or flight. Some of his friends, aware of what Queensbury was set on to expose and destroy Wilde, tried to encourage Wilde to go into exile, to go to France, to go somewhere where he would be free from Queensbury. Flight. And Wilde really didn't want to do that. He was at the height of his powers, of his success. He had plays running in London's West End. He was one of the dominant men of letters of his age. He did not want to go into exile, which he saw as a defeat. He had faced bullies in the past in his life, and he had seen them off. But that meant fight, and the only way he could fight Queensbury was to take him to law. That seems to have been the calculation. If it's fight or flight, he wanted to take his chances with legal fight rather than cowardly flight. But there were three other things going on in this calculation, in this decision to bring ruin on himself. Three miscalculations, in a way, which together combined to bind Wilde into a decision which, almost as soon as he reached the courtroom, he must have sensed was disastrously mistaken. The first was the family background behind Queensbury's persecution of Wilde, because it is possible to say, I think, in this case, that Oscar Wilde was collateral damage in a completely toxic family breakdown. The breakdown of the Douglas family, the patriarch, the Marquis, Queensbury, the monster, and his relationship not just with his third son, Alfred Bosie, the lover of Wilde, but his older two sons as well, and his relationship with the woman who was their mother, who had been married to Queensbury, but who was divorced from him. She had divorced him for adultery, but he had let it be known that he was disowning her, and he was disowning his wife because of the sons that she had borne him and had raised for him and with him. Because in Queensbury's view, these three, the eldest, Francis, the second, Percy, the third, Alfred, were not real men. They were pansies. They were effeminate men. He suspected all of them. In Percy's case, there's no evidence that Percy was gay, but Percy nonetheless was described by his father as a skunk of a man. He was incredibly abusive to his sons. In letters, in person, he was violent to them. He assaulted them. And it was because he did not consider them real men. He considered himself to be a real man, but at the same time, having divorced his first wife, being divorced by her, he remarried just before the trials of Oscar Wilde. And that marriage to a much younger woman was annulled, and it was annulled on the basis that he had been unable to consummate it. The real man, Queensbury, not like his pansy sons, had not been able to consummate his marriage to a younger woman. And this was known. It was discussed. It was reported in the newspapers. There were stories of Queensbury having to undergo a hideously humiliating medical examination to see if he was capable of sustaining an erection. He had been completely humiliated. And then tragedy struck. In 1894, his oldest son, his heir, the heir to the title, Francis Douglas, died in what was euphemistically referred to as a hunting accident or a shooting accident, but was widely understood to be suicide. He shot himself in the mouth. He shot himself in the mouth the day before his engagement was due to be announced. And it was widely suspected, rumoured, gossiped about in high Victorian society that Francis Douglas had been the lover of Lord Rosebery. Who was Lord Rosebery, you might ask? In 1894, from March 1894, he was the Prime Minister. He was a short-lived Liberal Prime Minister, not much remembered now, but during the period that included the death by suicide of Francis Douglas and the ramping up of the persecution by his father, Queensbury, of Oscar Wilde for what Queensbury believed Wilde was doing to the third son, Alfred Bosie. Throughout that period, Rosebery was Prime Minister, and Rosebery's name floated around the edges of all of these legal proceedings. It was rumoured that he was involved in some way, particularly with the now dead elder son. But that there was a Rosebery connection was widely known and widely suppressed. That was part of the political context for this case. Queensbury was effectively out of his mind by this point. He may have been out of his mind anyway, but he was out of his mind with humiliation, and one has to assume with genuine grief about the death of his son, Francis, and he was bent on destroying Wilde. Alfred Bosie knew what kind of man his father was, and he was exultant when his father left the card at Wilde's club, because he believed now at last they had grounds to take him to court. This was no longer things that were said, it was no longer hearsay, it was no longer vegetables left at the stage door. It was a written document in his father's hand that could be used in a court of law to show that his father was a monster, was bent on destruction. Alfred believed that the truth about his father would come out in court, the truth that he and Wilde knew about Queensbury. What a terrible man he was, what a terrible father he was, what a wicked man he was, how wicked he had been to their mother, how wicked he had been to all of his sons. The intimate knowledge they had of the monster in the middle of this family. And Alfred Douglas seems to have thought that it would come out in court, that a courtroom was a place in which all of that intimate knowledge could be laid bare. And it was a grotesque mistake, a terrible miscalculation, because that kind of intimate knowledge, the knowledge inside a family of exactly what had been going on, is not the kind of knowledge that comes out in court. It is personal knowledge. It is known to the people involved. But in case after case, in divorce proceedings, in these kinds of family disputes, a belief that the world will now see what a monster this person is or that person is, founders in a courtroom which is only interested in certain kinds of easily understandable facts or statements, and in witnesses who are willing to say certain things. Inside family knowledge withers and dies in a courtroom where a different picture often emerges. The person that is believed to be a monster sometimes comes out in court in a completely different light, which is what happened in this case. Queensbury in the libel trial did not emerge as a monster. Queensbury in the libel trial was presented by his lawyer, a man called Edward Carson, as a father concerned to protect his son. One of the ways in which he showed his desire to protect his son is that he had no desire for his son to appear on the witness stand. Wilde didn't want to put Bosie on the stand because he also wanted to protect him. But Queensbury wanted to present himself as the rival protector and the true protector of his son. He was coming for Wilde to rescue his son from Wilde. And that, in the court, is how it came across. So the first mistake that Wilde and Douglas made was to think that what they knew about the man who was persecuting them would emerge in court. And it's clear, though Bosie, who was young and hot-headed and in his own way a chip off the old block, he was not completely dissimilar from his father in his intemperate desires, including for revenge. Bosie never wavered in his view that they had to take his father on. But Wilde did have his doubts. And at one point, he tried to get out of the case by saying to Bosie, I don't think I can afford it. I can't afford the legal fees that this is going to involve. I think we have to back out. At which point, Bosie said, don't worry, my mother and my older brother will pay. He was confident that so toxic were the relationships inside that family, his mother, the woman who divorced Queensbury, would pay for Wilde's prosecution of her former husband. That should have rung every alarm bell out there. To be involved in that kind of family breakdown is almost certainly to become collateral damage. But at that point, Wilde felt unable to get out. The second mistake he made was to think that the two lines of attack that would be made on him, one about his lifestyle, his relationships, particularly his relationship with Alfred Douglas, but secondly on his art which would be presented in court as something which was the art of a man who was a posing homosexual. It was gay art. It celebrated gay sex, gay lifestyles, particularly the picture of Dorian Gray. And in court, a lot of time was spent in a relatively brief case with Carson, the man who was defending Queensbury, reading out lengthy extracts from a picture of Dorian Gray and asking Wilde to justify them, to defend them, to say that these weren't celebrations of homosexual love, or as they would put in the language of the time, something worse than that. Wilde was confident that he could defend his art, and he went into the court determined to stand on his art. He was going to be absolute about it. He was not willing to negotiate about it. It was good art. It was true art. It celebrated beauty and love. And that is where he was going to identify himself as the artist. Because that, for Wilde, was the thing that was beyond legal dispute and negotiation. It stood above all of that. He would defend himself in the realm of artistic judgment, where he was completely confident of his ground. And this would be, for Wilde, his true self. He was an artist. He self-identified as an artist. His relationships, including his relationships with men, were secondary to his identity as an artist. And I think Wilde believed that in adopting such a position, he was doing what all men in his position would do, not men who had a gay life, but men who had any public life at all, any high life in high Victorian society. Wilde believed, rightly, I think, that everybody had at least two lives. There was their public persona and the position that they wished to adopt and to defend and to identify themselves with in a public sense. And that could be, and in Wilde's case was, non-negotiable. And then there was all the negotiation that took place at the more squalid level of personal relationships, in and outside marriages, in and outside political careers, in a world in which prostitution was widespread, adultery was widespread, Christian values were rarely lived up to. There may be people who choose to identify themselves with Christian values. That, for them, would be non-negotiable. And then the other stuff has to be negotiated. For Wilde, it wasn't Christianity, it was art, with which he would identify himself. And then, like everyone else, the rest is for negotiation. And I think Wilde believed that was the kind of society in which he lived. He was an insider-outsider in that society, an Irishman in England, in London, but an extraordinarily successful one, who was very well connected, who knew a lot of people and knew the range of secret lives that men in particular lived, including, perhaps, the Prime Minister, and expected that general understanding that the second life is subservient to the first life, the life that you choose to make your identity. And Wilde's identity was not as a sodomite. It was as an artist. And he was wrong that that would work as a defense. It turned out that in a courtroom, and this may always be true in courtrooms, art is negotiable. Good art, bad art, your opinion, my opinion. Wilde says it's good. Carson, questioning him, thinks it's crude and crass. Who's to say? Who's to say where you draw the line? when it comes to questions of artistic judgment. The thing that turned out to be non-negotiable were some of the facts about Wilde's relationships, particularly his relationships with men other than Alfred Douglas. And that was the third mistake that he made. He and Bosie seem both to have believed that this case was about their relationship, and they were confident that they could defend their relationship. And Wilde was confident that he could defend that relationship in the language of love or art or beauty. But the case was not about Wilde's relationship with Douglas. And that became completely clear to Wilde when he was presented before the case started with the list of witnesses that the defence, Queensbury and his team, were going to call as part of their defence. It was a list of around 15 names of mainly young men whom Wilde knew, with many of whom he or Douglas had had brief kinds of sexual relationships, or at least sexual interactions, some of whom were known to have been blackmailing Wilde, threatening to reveal the nature of their sexual interactions. These were young men from all sorts of different backgrounds, a number of whom were known to be prostitutes. These were relationships which were not all, but mainly mercenary in some form or another. Wilde gave these young men money. These young men tried to extract money from Wilde, sometimes with threats of exposure. Those were the relationships that this case was about. Queensbury's lawyers, had no intention of making the case about Alfred Douglas. Their whole defence was that they were there to defend Douglas against Wilde. So whatever Wilde said about the beauty of his relationship with Douglas was irrelevant. They were defending Douglas against the man who had not that relationship, but these other relationships. And these other relationships were going to be the things that Wilde would have to justify. And in trying to justify them, he exposed the hollowness of his defence. Because if his defence was based on art and love and beauty, and that was how he chose to characterise his relationship with the man he loved, seems genuinely to have loved, Alfred Douglas, he couldn't use the same language for these transient, mercenary relationships that crossed class boundaries. So some of these young men were street boys, what came to be known as rent boys. And Wilde couldn't, and he couldn't find the language to justify those relationships in the same terms in which he thought he would make his case for his relationship with Queensbury's son, and therefore for the injustice of Queensbury's charge against him. And the hollowness of Wilde's position was exposed in his cross-examination by Carson. The case began with Wilde saying, "I'm the prosecutor." He made his case. The case for the prosecution was made. Wilde took the stand and he was questioned by his barrister, a man called Clark, and he described the history of his relationship with Queensbury, the confrontations that they'd had, the ways in which Queensbury was persecuting him. He denied Queensbury's charge against him. Then he had to be cross-examined as a witness for the prosecution. This is before the defence had even made its case, before any of those other witnesses had been called. And in that cross-examination, it happened in two parts. The first part, Carson questioned Wilde about his art, about Dorian Gray, about a magazine called The Chameleon, which was a magazine that had only appeared once. There had only been one issue of it. It contained poems celebrating the love between men, between an older man and a younger man, and Wilde had contributed to that magazine. And Wilde defended himself in high terms against the charge that his art was squalid and disgusting. And the more he defended himself in those terms, the more elevated and arch he became. He was mocking of Carson. He mocked Carson's ignorance. These two men had history. They'd been students together at Trinity College, Dublin. They didn't like each other. Wilde let it be known he had a kind of contempt for Carson and Carson's line of questioning. It was Philistine, it was vulgar, it was barbarian, and it didn't touch him. And then Carson moved on to the relationships that Wilde had with men other than Alfred Bosie Douglas. And towards the very end of his cross-examination came the point in Wilde's testimony where he destroyed himself. And I'm just going to read it This was the point at which Wilde knew, his friends knew, his lawyers knew that he could not continue the case and that he would have to withdraw. Carson began. Do you know Walter Granger? Wilde, yes. How old is he? Wilde. He was about 16 when I knew him. He was a servant at a certain house in High Street, Oxford, where Lord Alfred Douglas had rooms. I have stayed there several times. Granger waited at table. I never dined with him. If it is one's duty to serve, it is one's duty to serve. If it is one's pleasure to dine, it is one's pleasure to dine. So at this point, Wilde was still talking a bit like a character from The Importance of Being Earnest. He was very aphoristic. Carson. Did you ever kiss him? This is the point where Wilde destroyed his life. Wilde. Oh dear no, he was a peculiarly plain boy. He was unfortunately extremely ugly. I pitied him for it. Was that the reason why you did not kiss him? Oh, Mr. Carson, you are pertinently insolent. Carson. Did you say that in support of your statement, you never kissed him? Wilde. No, it's a childish question. Carson. Did you ever put forward that as a reason why you never kissed the boy? Wilde. Not at all. Carson. Why, sir, did you mention that this boy was extremely ugly? Wilde. For this reason, if I were asked why I did not kiss a doormat, I should say because I do not like to kiss doormats. I do not know why I mentioned that he was ugly, except that I was stung by the insolent question you put to me and the way you have insulted me throughout this hearing. Am I to be cross-examined? Because I do not like it. Carson. Why did you mention his ugliness? Wilde. It is ridiculous to imagine that any such thing could have occurred under any circumstances. Then why did you mention his ugliness, I ask you? Perhaps you insulted me by an insulting question. Was that a reason why you should say the boy was ugly? And then in the court transcript it says, the witness began several answers almost inarticulately, and none of them he finished. Carson repeated sharply, Why? Why? Why did you add that? At last the witness answered, Wilde, you sting me and insult me and try to unnerve me, and at times one says things flippantly when one ought to speak more seriously. I admit it. Carson, then you said it flippantly? Wilde, oh yes, it was a flippant answer. No indecencies ever took place between myself and Granger. I went down in June 1893 to stay at a cottage at Goring. I brought over Granger as under-butler. He had asked me to get him a situation. I never, on any occasion, asked him to come into my bedroom. And that, more or less, is where the cross-examination ended. Wilde had tried to blur the line between his aesthetic defence and his practical defence on matters of fact that he did not have indecent relationships with these young men. And in blurring that line, in trying to bring the language of beauty and ugliness into this part of his defence, he exposed himself to the brutal cross-examination that took place, at the end of which he had to admit, first, that he had spoken flippantly, that he was not being serious, and second, to fall back entirely on the facts, did not ask him into my bedroom, just trying to get him a position. Completely different kind of defence. And once it was clear that Granger and others were going to be called as witnesses, Wilde's position became impossible. He and his lawyers knew that he would have to withdraw the case. They tried to buy themselves a bit of time. They allowed Carson to proceed with his opening speech for the defence while they tried to work out what to do. And in Carson's opening speech, he made it completely clear which weakness in Wilde's position he had fatally exposed. Carson said, "Let us contrast the position which Mr. Wilde took up in cross-examination as to his books, which are for the select and not for the ordinary individual, high art, with the position he assumed as to the young men to whom he was introduced and those he picked up for himself. His books were written by an artist for artists. His words were not for Philistines or illiterates. Contrast that with the way in which Mr. Wilde chose his companions, He took up with Charles Parker, a gentleman's servant, with young Alphonse Conway, who sold papers on the pier at Worthing, with Scarfe, also a gentleman's servant. Then his excuse was no longer that he was dwelling in the regions of art, but he had such a noble, such a democratic soul, at that point the court burst out laughing, that he drew no social distinctions, and that it was quite as much pleasure to have the sweeping boy from the streets to lunch, or to dine with him, as the greatest litterateur or artist. He made the case about class, about Wilde's belief that his true self was that artistic self that operated in a rarefied atmosphere, and he contrasted that with Wilde's willingness to have social, and by implication, sexual relationships with boys and young men from the gutter, as Carson would have it, and that therefore the artistic defence was no defence, because these young men, they were not artists, they were barely literate, and money changed hands. And then, Carson said, and this was the point that Wilde and Douglas seemed to have failed to understand, they didn't realise this wasn't at issue. Carson said, I am not here to say anything has ever happened between Lord Alfred Douglas and Mr. Oscar Wilde. God forbid. He was not there to make any accusations about that relationship. This was a father, Queensbury, trying to rescue his son from falling into the trap that the street sweeper and the boy who sells papers on the pier at Worthing had fallen into. Carson said, everything shows that the young man, Douglas, was in a dangerous position in that he acquiesced in the domination of Mr. Wilde, a man of great ability and attainments. Wilde was an exploiter of young men. Douglas was an innocent. The father was concerned to rescue the son. Wilde had to withdraw the case. His lawyer tried to get him out of it by saying that he conceded not on the grounds of his relationships with these men, but on the basis that he accepted that there was a way of reading his art, Dorian Gray, the poems in Chameleon and his contribution to that magazine, as at least giving the appearance of acquiescing in the tolerance of homosexual love. So Wilde's lawyer said to the judge, under these circumstances, I hope your lordship will think that I am taking the right course, which I take after communicating with Mr. Oscar Wilde. That is to say, having regard to what has been referred to by my learned friend in respect of the matters connected with the literature and the letters, I feel we could not resist a verdict of not guilty in this case, i.e. Queensbury did not commit libel. Not guilty having reference to the word posing. That is, by implication, these books might give the appearance of a man posing as a celebrator of the love between men. Under these circumstances, I hope you will think I'm not going beyond the bounds of my duty, and that I am doing something to save, to prevent what would be a most horrible task. If I interpose now and say on behalf of Mr. Oscar Wilde that I would ask to withdraw from the prosecution. Withdraw from the prosecution, he said, with reference to the particulars connected with the publication of the picture of Dorian Gray and the publication of the Chameleon. And the judge responded by saying, you don't get to make that plea. This is a case in which Queensbury is either guilty or not guilty of libel. If he is not guilty of libel, that is because charges that Queensbury have made have been justified. And also then there is a question for the jury, which is whether the accusations, the charges that Queensbury made were in the public interest. So the judge said to the jury, your verdict must be either guilty or not guilty. And he directed them to return a verdict of not guilty, not with caveats, not guilty with reference to the picture of Dorian Gray, but simply Queensbury is not guilty, posing as a sodomite, posing as sodomite, posing sodomite, doesn't matter. Not guilty, that is libel. The only question for the jury was making that accusation public in the public interest? So they were also asked to return a judgment on that question. And after a very short consultation, they came back and said, Queensbury is not guilty of libel, and we believe that the accusations he made against Wilde were in the public interest, which was all the permission that the Crown needed to prosecute Wilde for criminal acts in reference to the young men who were going to be called as witnesses in the libel case. And Wilde was ruined. The only question that remained to Wilde was fight or flight, and many of his friends encouraged him to leave the country, take the train, get on the boat to France before they come and arrest you, because they're coming for you within hours. And Wilde either decided not to flee or he dithered. Views differ on this. But he dithered long enough that they did come. They did arrest him. He was taken and held in a police cell. And the wheels of justice started to turn. Within the month, he was back in court, now as a defendant, charged with acts of indecency. The prosecution had narrowed the range of cases down. It was a very different kind of trial. Wilde was the defendant, but also the witnesses were different kinds of witnesses in the sense they now had to make the case for the prosecution. Wilde was no longer the prosecutor. In the libel trial, it was enough for there to be this list of young men and for them all basically to be telling a similar kind of story, to throw doubt on Wilde's case that he had been libelled. But in the criminal trial, it had to be proven that acts of indecency took place. And there was a problem for the prosecution because these young men were not respectable. Wilde was prosecuted alongside a young man who had once been semi-respectable in the sense that he had gone to a private school and had inherited money, a man called Alfred Taylor. Wilde and Taylor were prosecuted together for indecency. Taylor was known to have frequented some of the houses in which the young men that Wilde was accused of having indecent relationships with lived. These were understood to be different kinds of brothels. Taylor was understood to be someone who facilitated these kinds of interactions. He was also known to be someone who kept a collection of women's clothes and makeup in his apartment. So cross-dressing was involved too. But still the case had to be made against both men, not simply that they dressed in women's clothes, and no one accused Wilde of dressing in women's clothes, but that they committed and were seen to have committed, or were known to have committed, either by witnesses or by the men involved, acts of indecency. Chambermaids were called, butlers were called, but they hadn't seen anything. They had just seen things that might suggest acts of indecency took place. In the criminal trials, one of the pieces of evidence, and this is how far and how quickly the case of Oscar Wilde moved from a defense of art to brute facts. In the criminal trials, one of the pieces of evidence concerned Wilde's sheets at his hotel, which had on them, in the language of the courtroom, fecal matter. And the question that was discussed in court, in open court, was whether this was as a result of diarrhea or of anal sex. That was where the case reached by the time it had got to criminal proceedings. Wilde did not have much of a defence, and in the first criminal trial, the most celebrated part of his defence was an extension of the prosecution that had failed in the libel case. It was a defence of art, of beauty, and of his relationship with Alfred Douglas. Probably the most celebrated passage in all three trials was when Wilde was being questioned. He was asked about a phrase that appeared in one of the letters that he wrote to Alfred Douglas, letters that had been read out in court. And it used the phrase, "the love that dare not speak its name." And Wilde was asked, what is this? What does it refer to? And he said, the love that dare not speak its name in this century is such a great affection of an elder for a younger man as there was between David and Jonathan, such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy, and such as you find in the sonnets of Michelangelo and Shakespeare. It is that deep, spiritual affection that is as pure as it is perfect. It dictates and pervades great works of art, like those of Shakespeare and Michelangelo, and those two letters of mine, such as they are. It is in this century misunderstood, so much misunderstood, that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name, and on account of it, I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful. It is fine. It is the noblest form of affection. There is nothing unnatural about it. It is intellectual, and it repeatedly exists between an elder and a younger man, when the elder man has intellect and the younger man has all the joy, hope, and glamour of life before him. That it should be so the world does not understand. The world mocks at it and sometimes puts one in the pillory for it. And the court record reads, open brackets, loud applause mingled with some hisses. Many of those who were there for the criminal trial described it as Wilde's greatest moment, his pure moment of performance. And he had the court, he had the public. They were with him. But it was no defence, because that was his defence of his relationship with Bosie. But it couldn't be his defence of his relationship that included potentially the sheets in his hotel. The joy, the hope and glamour of life embodied in these young men was not something that Wilde was in the end consistently able to identify in his relationships with the boy who sold the papers on Worthing Pier, with what the court understood to be men in menial roles, serving roles, relationships that were mercenary and transactional, and relationships that were squalid, as they understood it. And yet, the second great mystery of the trials of Oscar Wilde, the first being, why did he prosecute? The second is, how did the jury fail to reach a verdict? They were directed very clearly by the judge. The case had been well prepared. It was recognised that Wilde did not have much of a defence beyond that defence, and that defence would not rescue him from these accusations. And yet, after 3 hours, the jury came back and said that they were split. They were unable to reach a verdict. And so no verdict was reached. And no one knows what happened in the jury room for the second trial of Oscar Wilde, the first criminal trial. There was a lot of gossip about it, rumours in the clubs of London, which by this point were completely fascinated by, obsessed with, in some cases terrified of, the fate of Oscar Wilde. It was thought that only one juror held out. In some stories it was two, but in most stories it was just one. Who was the one person who held out from the persecution of Oscar Wilde? The story was spread that it was an Irishman or a man with Irish sympathies, Irish Republican sympathies, who just did not want to see another Irishman brought down by the English establishment. We don't know. At the end of the case, the question had to be asked, would the Crown pursue Wilde again? And there were many voices who said, enough is enough. This man has been destroyed physically in the dock. He looked completely different at the end of April than the beginning. He was haunted. He was gaunt. He was ill. His reputation had been destroyed. His plays were no longer being performed. They'd been pulled in London, in New York. His friends were deserting him. It was almost certain that he would have to go into exile. Why continue the prosecution? The man had been destroyed. The answer that came back in rumour from, among others, the Solicitor General, was that he had to be pursued again because of the beastly rumours about Rosebery. The thought that if Wilde was not prosecuted and convicted, the story would spread. It was because he had friends in high places, because Rosebery didn't want the story about his relationship with another Douglas to come out, that there was a cover-up. Wilde had to be destroyed to prevent the conspiracy theory from widening its net. Here was a network of seedy gay life that revolved around a celebrated man. If it could be contained to that man, justice in the eyes of the people who wanted to preserve the establishment position would be seen to have been done. If Wilde was allowed to go into exile, the stories would circulate that he had been let off for a reason. And so the third trial took place. And in this trial, there was no wriggle room. There was no mystery juror. There was nothing to save Wilde. His lawyer tried this time to rescue Wilde from being tried alongside Alfred Taylor, and he succeeded. The judge agreed that the two cases would be heard separately, which was good for Wilde because he could try and claim that he was not Alfred Taylor. He was not a procurer of young men. He did not dress in women's clothing. What destroyed Wilde finally was the judge's second decision, which is that the Taylor case would be heard first. It was heard first and Taylor was convicted. And once Taylor had been convicted, it was almost impossible for a case to be made that Wilde was innocent. The witnesses were well briefed. Many of them had been paid off. The Crown was determined to get its man. The judge in this case was absolutely clear that he knew what had to be done at the end of it. And after the jury had come back after a few hours and convicted Wilde, like Taylor, of acts of indecency for which both men were sentenced to 2 years hard labour, the judge in this third case said, "It is the worst case I have ever heard." And this is a judge who had presided over murder trials. The judge gave the official position. Oscar Wilde and Alfred Taylor, the crime of which you have been convicted is so bad that one has to put stern restraint upon oneself to prevent oneself from describing, in language I would rather not use, the sentiments which must rise to the breast of every man of honour who has heard the details of these 2 terrible trials. It is no use, he said, for me to address you. People who can do these things must be dead to all sense of shame, and one cannot hope to produce any effect upon them. It is the worst case I have ever tried. So the final position is that a line would be drawn around this case. Inside that line, where Wilde and Taylor stood, was the worst thing that had ever happened, worse than murder, acts of indecency between men. And on the other side of that line was Victorian society. Wilde had thought the line was between high art and low art, between beauty and ugliness, between his true self as an artist and his negotiated sense as a man in the world. He was wrong. That was never going to be the line that was drawn in a late Victorian courtroom, not in the libel case, not in the criminal cases. The line that would be drawn would be a line that had Wilde on one side of it, and Rosebery and Queensbury and everyone else on the other side of it. The 2 subsequently other best-known Irish men of letters of this period both offered advice to Oscar Wilde during his downfall. One was George Bernard Shaw. Wilde consulted Shaw, then a relatively young man, in London before the libel case as to whether he should proceed, and Shaw said, "Don't do it." Pragmatic, hard-headed, utilitarian George Bernard Shaw said to Wilde, "Get out. If the choice is fight or flight, flee. This will destroy you." And it sounded like at their meeting that Wilde was listening to Shaw, but then Bosie, Alfred Douglas, showed up and accused Shaw and Wilde's other friends of betraying them both. And Wilde was dragged back into the toxic family drama from which there was no escape. The other person who came to give Wilde advice was W.B. Yeats. After the second trial, the first criminal trial, Wilde was allowed out on bail, and he lived in London. Hard for him to find places to be, but he had 1 or 2 friends left. And Yeats came to see him. Some of his friends, Wilde's friends, were concocting plans to get Wilde out of the country, to save him the final trial, to get him out in disguise, to fake him a passport, to smuggle him out of Britain into France and get him safely on the continent. And Yeats was there to tell him not to do it. He had to face his destiny. He had to face his nemesis. Because Yeats said his art would survive it. Indeed, his art would be enhanced by it. If Wilde went down fighting, history would reward him. If he fled, he would be betraying his art. And Yeats went to see him and communicated with him as an artist to say that your art, that defence that you undertook, it is your only defence. And in the end, you will win. You will not win in a court of law, but you will win in the court of history, of public opinion, artistic opinion. You will be redeemed. You will be saved, but you will not be saved in an English courtroom. And of course, Yeats was right. Was it good advice? It's impossible to say, but it was correct advice. Wilde did meet his doom, and he met it with some dignity, some courage. He still produced some great art out of it, the Ballad of Reading Gaol, though it broke him completely. It didn't just destroy his health, didn't just destroy his happiness. It destroyed him. The experience destroyed him. And within a few years, he was dead, a completely broken man. But history did redeem him, and he is a hero and a martyr and a revered artist. And so Yeats was right. That was the way it would go if Wilde saw this thing through to his bitter end. Hard advice. Artist to artist, but human to human. Hard advice, not Shaw's pragmatic advice, Yeats's cruel advice, cruel and true. And yet there were others who had said to Wilde, before any of this happened, when he was considering the libel action, don't do it. You have responsibilities. You have responsibilities as an artist, as a public man. If you do this, if you make a great spectacle of your relationships and are destroyed in the act of doing it, you may think you're defending some high ideal of love or beauty, the love that dare not speak its name. You may think you're defending that, but you won't be defending that. You will be destroying that because you will set back the cause of men who love men for generations. You will create a climate of persecution and fear and hysteria around gay relationships. It was an intolerant time, but on the whole, that intolerance was not tested in the law courts. There were understandings. There were ways in which Victorian society dealt with its hideous moral hypocrisies. But Wilde decided to force the issue. And there were those who said to him, in forcing the issue, you betray us all of us who love men, men who love men, because we will be the victims. You may destroy yourself, but you will also create a climate of fear that will take generations to dissipate. And they were right too. The trials of Oscar Wilde started a period which lasted through to the 1960s, in which gay men were persecuted. Hysteria surrounded the gay life, particularly at the highest levels of politics and society. The hypocrisies became the source of terror and confusion and vicious persecution. Wild conspiracy theories flourished, particularly at times of stress during the First World War. Wild theories about networks of gay men who had infiltrated high British political and social life, much of it at the behest of the Germans. Wild conspiracy theories about celebrity networks, political networks, legal networks, the protection of friends by friends. It poisoned British life for 2 generations. Maybe it would have happened anyway. Something similar happened in France. I'll talk a bit more about that next time in relation to the Dreyfus affair. This time was ripe for that kind of clamping down on what had been not tolerated, but at least an understanding had been reached that there were ways of negotiating this double life. And the space for the double life shrunk hugely because of Oscar Wilde, because of what he did. Does that mean he was wrong to do it? He made a mistake. There's no question the libel action was a mistake. And he judged it mistakenly. Shaw was right. Get out. He didn't get out. He either felt he couldn't or he wouldn't. It was a mistake. Was it wrong? It's impossible to say it was wrong. It was righteous. Wilde knew it was righteous. Queensbury was a monster, one of the monsters of the age. He's known for the Queensbury rules. But as Wilde's biographer Richard Ellman said of the Marquis of Queensbury, for a man whose name is associated with rules, he was as unruly as it's possible to be. No one could control this man. And he wreaked havoc, death and destruction throughout the world as he moved through it. And Wilde was on the side of the angels. So it was a mistake. It wasn't wrong. Was Yeats right to say that Wilde would be redeemed by history? Yes. Were some of his other friends right to say that in taking on this kind of martyrdom, Wilde was betraying the love that he was trying to defend because he was exposing it to the worst of English hypocrisy, the worst of English persecution, the worst aspects of English public life? Yes, that was true too. It was all true. The trials of Oscar Wilde were all the things that people said of them. 2 quick reminders before I go. The first is that if you'd like to hear the second part of my conversation with Robert Saunders about the history of unemployment and where we are now with the politics of unemployment in the age of automation and who knows what else, that's available now on PPF Plus. To subscribe, all you have to do is go to our website, ppfideas.com, or click on the link in the show description. You will get all of our bonus episodes and you will get ad-free listening. The other reminder is that the first film in our autumn film series is coming up quite soon. It's on September the 5th at the Regent Street Cinema in London. It is a screening of Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, followed by a live recording of this podcast with the best-selling crime-writing duo Nikki Gerard and Sean French, talking about Hitchcock and Nietzsche and a lot else. If you would like to come, tickets are available now. Just go to the events page on our website, ppfideas.com, or click on the link in the show description. We'd love to see you there. Next time, in Politics on Trial, I'm going to be talking about a trial that happened at almost exactly the same time as the trials of Oscar Wilde. Another series of legal proceedings involving a vast and epic, a poisonous conspiracy theory that nearly destroyed an entire nation. It's the Dreyfus affair. Next time. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.